The air of Lower Manhattan on that muggy afternoon in 1898 was a thick stew of coal smoke, cheap perfume, and frantic excitement. Every window of the tall brownstone buildings overlooking the parade route was flung open, hosting a flurry of starched collars and feathered hats. Below, the cobblestone street was swallowed by a sea of humanity, thousands pressed together, their collective breath held in anticipation. This wasn't just a parade, it was the arrival of the greatest show on earth, and its undeniable star was about to pass by. The moment the camera shutter froze the scene, the Sun Chariot was a vision of gaudy, unrestrained spectacle. It was a masterpiece of gilded carving, towering over the crowd on massive, iron-rimmed wheels, pulled by a team of 4 colossal draft horses whose harnesses glittered. Atop the chariot, performers, a ringmaster in a top hat and 2 daring female acrobats, waved and postured, feeding the crowd's hysteria. But all eyes, all gasping attention, were fixed on the center of the gilded cage. Inside, bathed in the strange, diffused light of the urban canyon, was Jupiter. He was a monarch of shadow and brute force, an immense male African lion with a mane the color of burnt umber. His roar, a deep, resonant tremor that shook the very ground, was the only sound that truly mattered. Even in the photograph, you can feel the oppressive weight of his presence, the sheer, impossible animal magnetism that held the city captive. The parade was a controlled explosion of sensation, a moment of untamed wilderness dragged through the civilized world. No one was paying attention to the intricate double tumbler lock on the cage door, they were simply captivated by the magnificent beast it held. This, everyone believed, was the spectacle at its peak, the moment before the show began. They had no idea the show was already over. The parade, a roaring machine of brass bands and waving banners, continued its slow, stately progress, turning right from the wide Main Avenue onto the narrower canyon of Bleecker Street. It was a tight turn, demanding the coachman pull hard on the reins of the massive horses. This maneuver caused a ripple in the crowd, a sudden surge backward, then forward, as people fought for a better sight line down the new street. It was precisely during this moment of maximal physical distraction and noise that the atmosphere shifted. The change wasn't sudden, like a gunshot, but insidious. It began as a faint, almost imperceptible lessening of the collective sound. The booming of the circus band, which moments before had rattled the tenement windows, seemed to lose its edge. The excited chatter and screams of the audience dulled, as if a great, invisible velvet curtain had dropped between the crowd and the spectacle. People started to look around, not for a better view, but with a vague, unsettling confusion. Where was the roar? Jupiter's terrifying vocal power had been the anchor of the parade, a rhythmic, pulsing reminder of the danger lurking in the gilded cage. Now, there was nothing. Only the heavy, rhythmic clop of the horses' hooves and the creak of the Sun Chariot's ornate wheels on the uneven cobblestones. The lion tamer, Silas Thorne, who was walking near the rear of the cage, suddenly stopped dead, his face draining of color. He looked like a man who had felt a cold wind on a stifling summer day. "Listen," a woman near the curb whispered, clutching her companion's arm. But there was nothing to listen to. That was the terror. By the time the Sun Chariot lumbered into the straightaway of Bleecker Street, a full, unnatural silence had fallen over the heart of the parade. The energy of the crowd had completely inverted. Instead of manic excitement, there was a heavy, suffocating bewilderment. When a young police officer, Constable O'Malley, finally noticed the bizarre stillness emanating from the magnificent carriage, he blew his whistle, a shrill, piercing sound that cut the silence like glass. He raised his hand, ordering the parade to halt, inadvertently freezing the entire street and setting the stage for the discovery. The great beast's voice had been extinguished, and the city's heart was pounding in dread. Constable O'Malley's shrill whistle had stopped the entire spectacle, leaving the massive Sun Chariot marooned in the sudden, eerie quiet of Bleecker Street. The officer, driven by a nameless dread, finally managed to push through the densely packed spectators, his path cleared by the terrified uncertainty of the crowd. He reached the side of the great carriage, his breath ragged. The gilded structure still looked magnificent, but something essential was missing. The sense of potent, contained threat was gone. O'Malley's eyes were immediately drawn to the large, ornamental iron door of the cage. He had expected to see Jupiter pacing, or at least staring out with malevolent impatience. But the view was unobstructed. The center of the chariot, the place reserved for the king, was vacant. Jupiter was not resting in the corner. He was not drinking from his hidden trough. The enclosure, custom-built for his gargantuan size, was utterly, bafflingly empty. The police officer stumbled back, pointing a trembling finger. "It's gone. The lion is gone." This was the spark that ignited the frenzied chaos. The initial dread transformed instantly into sheer, primal terror. People shrieked, trampling over each other to get away from the ornate, suddenly menacing carriage. Women fainted, men shoved, and the horses, sensing the panic, whinnied and reared violently, threatening to overturn the very chariot that had lost its cargo. The head of the parade detail, Inspector Abernathy, arrived minutes later. He surveyed the pandemonium, and then fixed his gaze on the cage door. The lock, the infamous, custom-made double tumbler mechanism, was visually intact. There were no signs of a brute force attack, no splintered wood, no bent bars, no fresh scrapes on the intricate lockplate. Yet, the heavy iron door was not secured. It swung gently inward, just a few inches, in rhythm with the carriage's subtle rocking motion. Abernathy barked commands for a perimeter lockdown, but his voice was strained. He looked at the vast empty space where the great beast had just been, then at the intact lock, and back at the sheer magnitude of the fleeing crowd. The implication was horrific. Not only was a lion loose in the heart of the city, but it had escaped by a method that made absolutely no rational sense. The silence had given way to an earth-shattering wave of immediate, frantic public terror. The circus crew arrived minutes behind Inspector Abernathy, pushing past the shell-shocked onlookers. At the front was Silas Thorne, Jupiter's keeper and tamer. He was a man carved from leather and grit, whose hands bore the permanent scars of a life spent in close communion with creatures of tooth and claw. He hadn't run, he'd merely walked, with a terrifying slowness, towards the sun chariot. When he finally reached the cage, Thorne didn't inspect the lock or shout panicked commands. He simply gripped the ornate iron bars and stared into the yawning, empty space. A low, guttural sound escaped his throat, a sound more animal than human, echoing the terror that had just vanished. "Jupiter," he muttered, his voice raw. The massive horses pulling the carriage shifted uneasily, sensing their master's distress. Inspector Abernathy, desperate for any explanation, seized the tamer's arm. "Thorne, what happened? The lock is untouched. Where would he go?" Thorne barely registered the question. His eyes scanned the interior floor of the cage, not for footprints, but for something less tangible. His face, usually a mask of stoic control, was contorted by a profound, desolate fear. He knew the beast better than his own family. Their relationship wasn't one of master and pet, but of mutual, tense respect. He wouldn't break it," Thorne finally whispered, his eyes fixing on a spot on the floor. "He never needed to." He turned to Abernathy, his gaze burning with a horrifying certainty. "It's impossible. The mechanism, it's foolproof." He was content. He was there. Thorne stumbled back, leaning against the carriage wheel, his strength suddenly gone. He looked up at the gaping crowd, then back at the gilded cage, and his voice dropped to a barely audible croak, a final, cryptic declaration that would haunt the investigation. "That thing, it only leaves when it wants you to know it's gone." Before Abernathy could press him, before anyone could make sense of the strange intimacy in his terror, Thorne clutched his chest, a sharp, ragged intake of breath. He slumped to the cobblestones, his eyes wide and unseeing, the secret of Jupiter and the sun chariot dying on his lips. The tamer had protected his charge until the very end. The death of Silas Thorne immediately shifted the focus from the escaped animal to the mystery of the empty cage. Inspector Abernathy ordered a small team of engineers and blacksmiths from the city's finest workshops to examine the sun chariot's lock. The mechanism was not a standard padlock, it was a testament to the circus's obsession with security and flair, a custom-designed, brass and steel double-tumbler mechanism. This was not a system that could be simply broken. The lock was engineered by a renowned, albeit eccentric, safemaker known only as the Architect, who had guaranteed it was impregnable to all save God and gunpowder. It required 2 separate sequences of internal levers to align simultaneously. Even a scratch or a minute pressure applied incorrectly would cause the entire mechanism to seize up and jam permanently, alerting the guards. The investigators worked under the blinding glare of early electric lamps, their scrutiny intense. They photographed the lock from every angle, dusted it for prints, and even delicately probed the keyhole. Their conclusion was unanimous and chilling. The lock had not been picked. It had not been forced. It had not been damaged in any way. The massive iron bolt that secured the door to the jamb was simply retracted. "It was opened with the key, Inspector," stated Mr. Harding, a veteran safe expert, wiping the grease from his hands. "No other way. The mechanism is clean, intact. No tool marks, no signs of heat, no evidence of explosive residue." But the key was known to be secured in Thorne's personal strongbox, kept in the circus train's master car miles away. Furthermore, the sheer, complex weight of the door made it impossible to open silently from the outside without tremendous effort, especially not in the few minutes between the photograph being taken and the parade being halted. Abernathy stared at the gilded door, now swung slightly open like an invitation to a chamber of horrors. He realized the investigation had reached its most terrifying juncture. If the lion hadn't escaped by force or cunning from the outside, and the tamer hadn't opened it, then the act of opening the cage must have been either a colossal error by a panicked, unseen circus hand, or the door had been opened from the inside. The very possibility suggested an intelligence, or a capability, that made the official rogue anarchist theory sound like a child's fairy tale. The Sun Chariot was not just a cage, it was an enigma. In the face of an unsolvable mystery, a secured cage that was suddenly empty, the city's leaders and the circus management quickly coalesced around a politically convenient narrative: the rogue anarchist. It was a plausible scapegoat for the era. The late 1890s were rife with labor unrest and fear of political radicals. It was far easier, and certainly less terrifying for the public, to believe in a madman with a custom lockpicking tool than in a supernatural disappearance or an impossible creature. Inspector Abernathy, under immense pressure to restore order and quash the public panic, reluctantly adopted the line. The escape, his official statement read, was a deliberate act of sabotage intended to instill fear and discredit the authorities. The newspapers seized upon the angle with ravenous glee. Headlines screamed of "terrorist lions" and "dynamite desperados." The focus shifted from the absence of the lion to the hunt for a human culprit. Teams were dispatched to known radical meeting places, taverns, and the homes of recently arrested agitators. Police dragged in dozens of suspects, men and women whose only crime was political dissent or a shabby appearance. Interrogations were brutal, centered on the meticulous skill required to disable the double tumbler lock. Yet, despite the intense scrutiny, the theory was full of holes. The supposed anarchist had left no note, no claim of responsibility, and no evidence of forced entry. Furthermore, the motive was weak. A lion release was a chaotic, one-off act, lacking the political symbolism of bombing a government building or assassinating a public figure. If the goal was chaos, why not detonate a small explosive amidst the densely packed crowd instead of risking a lion's unpredictable nature? The few dissenting voices in the department, usually dismissed as romantic idealists, pointed back to the evidence. If he was a locksmith, Corporal Jensen argued, pointing at the photograph of the untouched lock, why open it with the key? And if he had the key, why not just release it quietly at night? The official pursuit continued, but it felt hollow. It was a comfortable lie, a diversion necessary for the city's sanity. But as the manhunt intensified, the quiet, unsettling feeling that the police were chasing the wrong phantom, a human one, began to settle over the investigation. They were looking for a lockpicker in a world where the lock was never truly the problem. The investigation's next logical step was to interview the only people guaranteed to have had an unobstructed view of the Sun Chariot, the 4 circus employees tasked with guarding it. These men, 2 rough-looking types named Garrow and Hicks, who walked alongside the cage, and the 2 coachmen, were brought in for questioning, but their testimonies were maddeningly consistent and utterly useless. Every guard swore they had never taken their eyes off the cage. Their job was simple and critical: to prevent the public from getting too close and to watch for any sign of trouble from within. They described Jupiter as being restless but normal right up until the moment of the turn onto Bleecker Street. "He was roaring, same as ever," insisted Hicks, a man whose eyes kept darting around the interrogation room. "A huge, deep sound. Then, we made the corner and it was just gone. Like the air swallowed it." The coachman, equally adamant, spoke only of the noise and the crowd. The parade was so dense, they claimed, that their entire focus was on steering the 4 powerful horses without crushing anyone on the curb. They heard the lion, then they didn't. They felt the chariot's slight shift in weight as it turned, but nothing more. The critical flaw in their accounts lay in the time frame. The distance between the spot where the photograph was taken and the spot where Constable O'Malley called the halt was measured precisely, 360 feet. At the parade's slow pace, this transition took approximately 3 minutes. 3 minutes was an eternity for a lion to escape, yet all 4 guards swore they saw Jupiter at the start of the stretch and noticed the silence only after they'd completed the turn. How could a massive gilded door be unlatched and a 400-pound lion silently slip out, disappearing into a crowd packed shoulder to shoulder, without a single witness raising an alarm? There was no blood, no torn clothes, no sound of a scuffle, nothing to indicate a violent escape. The police tried to find contradictions, suggesting they must have been distracted by the women on the roof or the cheering audience, but the guards clung fiercely to their narrative of attentive watchfulness. Their unanimous conclusion was the most chilling of all: the lion was there, and then it wasn't. The guards hadn't failed to see the escape, they insisted the escape itself was physically invisible, or perhaps, instantaneous. They were witnesses who saw nothing, and their empty testimony only reinforced the terrifying notion that the problem wasn't the cage, but the creature it contained. The official search for the anarchist was yielding nothing, forcing Inspector Abernathy's team to reluctantly return to the site of the disappearance. In the tight cordon surrounding the Sun chariot, a young, meticulous detective named Reynolds began a painstaking search of the cobblestones and the curb. He wasn't looking for a wrench or a footprint, he was looking for something organic. His persistence was finally rewarded 3 blocks past where the chariot had been halted, near the corner of another side street, a distance far beyond the scene of the crime. Tucked between a gas lamp post and a discarded flyer, he found it, a single, thick tuft of dark, coarse animal hair. It was unmistakable, a piece of Jupiter's magnificent mane. The location of the discovery was the first tangible piece of evidence, yet it only compounded the mystery. If the lion had escaped quietly near the turning onto Bleecker Street, why were the only remains found 3 full blocks away, in the opposite direction of its supposed escape? A heavy, frightened animal would likely have headed for the river or the nearest park, not casually dropped a trophy of itself on a residential corner. Simultaneously, a minor detail surfaced from the re-interviewing of the crowd. A street vendor who sold pretzels near the crucial corner mentioned a man who had been standing beside him, cheering wildly at the spectacle. The vendor couldn't describe the man well, only that he wore a peculiar, wide-brimmed hat that obscured his face. "He was yelling, I thought he was enjoying the show," the vendor recounted. Then, when the roar stopped, just after the chariot passed, he went silent. He didn't run with the rest. He just turned, very deliberately, and walked briskly down the side street, heading right toward where you found that hair. The witness was positive the man left before the official panic erupted, and he left with a purposeful stride, not one of fear. This missing man wasn't running from a lion. He seemed to be following an unseen signal, walking calmly in the direction of the bizarre discovery. The combination of the misplaced mane and the peculiar behavior of the man in the hat strongly suggested that the escape wasn't a spontaneous act of panic by the animal, but a carefully coordinated exit. The dark hair wasn't shed, it was a marker. The man wasn't a spectator, he was an accomplice. But what kind of accomplice shepherds a lion 3 blocks through a dense crowd, only for the animal to vanish entirely? The next crucial figure in the spiraling mystery was Mr. Alastair Finch, the eccentric designer behind the magnificent Sun chariot. Finch was not a mere carpenter, he was a self-proclaimed artisan of containment, a man obsessed with the fusion of high drama and absolute security. Finding him proved difficult, He lived in a self-imposed exile in a cluttered workshop filled with sketches of impenetrable vaults and impossible locks. When Abernathy finally tracked him down, Finch initially waxed lyrical about the double tumbler lock, his masterpiece of frustration. He took offense at the suggestion that the mechanism had failed. "The lock didn't fail, Inspector," he declared, his eyes gleaming with pride and a strange, nervous energy. "It's perfect. If the door was open, it was opened correctly." Pressed about the sheer impossibility of the situation, the key was miles away, Silas Thorne was dead, Finch's confidence began to crack. Abernathy noted the subtle tremor in the man's hands as he paced around a miniature model of the chariot. Finch had built the cage not just as a spectacle, but as a challenge to himself, a testament to his own genius. After hours of intense questioning and outright accusation, Finch finally broke, revealing the structure's terrifying secret. He hadn't just built a cage, he'd built a piece of performance art with a contingency plan. The circus management, they insisted on the dramatic flair, Finch stammered, his voice barely audible. A true escape door. Not for the lion, of course. For the tamer, in case of a sudden, mortal threat from the beast. He described a hidden, secondary feature, a narrow passage concealed beneath the central feeding platform, leading to a detachable wooden ramp disguised as an ornamental wheel arch on the far side of the chariot. This emergency egress was secured by a second, far simpler lock, a magnetic catch, that could be activated by a subtle pressure plate disguised within the gilded railings of the chariot's roof. The revelation changed everything. The lion didn't need to pick the main lock. It didn't need a key. It simply needed someone on the roof to activate the release, creating a small, silent opening through which a large creature could slip out, unnoticed by the crowds below who were hypnotized by the visible spectacle. The revelation of the magnetic catch release hidden beneath the ornamental wheel arch suddenly cast a chilling new light on the original photograph. Abernathy pulled out the sepia-toned image again, his gaze fixed not on the roaring lion, but on the very top of the gilded cage, on the figures who had been previously dismissed as mere dramatic window dressing. There were two of them, a male ringmaster figure, standing tall and waving, and a smaller, slightly obscured figure, one of the female acrobats, perched near the center. They were in the only position in the entire procession that offered both a perfect view of the street and direct access to the hidden mechanism that Alastair Finch had described. Finch had said the release was activated by a subtle pressure plate disguised within the gilded railings of the chariot's roof. Abernathy felt a cold wave of realization wash over him. The woman, with her lithe frame and balance, would have been the perfect candidate. Did her pose in the photograph, her arms slightly raised, her weight perhaps shifted, capture the very moment she engaged the plate? Was the crowd's ecstasy the perfect cover for this subtle act of release? The police quickly identified the performers. The ringmaster was a jovial, boisterous man named Maximilian who was known to be entirely focused on the crowd. The woman, however, was a recent, quiet hire named Eliza. She was noted for her extraordinary grace and a strange aloofness, keeping to herself in the bustling circus camp. Both Maximilian and Eliza were now gone. They hadn't stayed with the circus train. They hadn't reported to the police. They had simply vanished immediately after the parade, leaving behind their meager possessions and their costumes. The investigators searched the roof of the Sun chariot. Underneath the gilded flourish where Eliza had been perched, they found a small, almost invisible scuff mark on the brass plating, the exact spot Finch had indicated for the pressure plate. It wasn't a scratch from a rough movement, it was the faint imprint of a soft, polished leather boot. The implication was clear. The people on the roof hadn't been watching the parade, they had been operating the cage. They were accomplices, but to what? To an escape, or to a prearranged transfer. The hunt for a lion had transformed into the search for two elusive performers, raising the unsettling question: did the lion flee the scene, or was it calmly walked away by the two figures who had initiated its freedom from their vantage point at the top of the world? With the performers Maximilian and Eliza now the primary focus, Inspector Abernathy turned his attention to the circus backlit, the sprawling, temporary city of tents and wagons where the performers lived and trained. This was the shadowy world behind the glitter, a place fueled by secrecy and superstition. The atmosphere in the backlit was tense, thick with the smell of sawdust, elephants, and fear. The remaining circus hands and performers, initially tight-lipped, began to offer guarded information under persistent questioning. It quickly became clear that the circus, despite its public image of wholesome wonder, harbored a dark history of disappearances. These weren't necessarily escapes or crimes, but inexplicable vanishings. There were hushed rumors of animals that simply stopped eating and then, overnight, were gone. Of performers who signed contracts and then were never seen after their debut. "The Great Barnum Show," one disgruntled roustabout muttered, "doesn't fire people, sir. It absorbs them." The whispers coalesced around a strange protective unit within the organization, a select group of hands, including Silas Thorne, who were intensely loyal to the lion, Jupiter. They seemed to treat the animal not as property, but as a sovereign, tending to its needs with a reverence that bordered on religious devotion. More disturbing were the details about Eliza, the missing acrobat. She had arrived 3 months prior with no known history or family, recruited for her almost supernatural agility. She never spoke of her past. But several employees recalled seeing her late at night, not practicing, but sitting alone near Jupiter's cage, often without the presence of the tamer. She wouldn't touch the bars. She would simply sit and watch the lion with an unblinking, unsettling stillness. One older, frightened performer claimed that on the night before the parade, he heard Eliza speaking to the cage, but not in any language he recognized. It was a low, sibilant sound, and when he peeked through the tent flap, Jupiter was not roaring in response. He was listening, his great head tilted, with an unervingly calm, almost intelligent concentration. The backlit wasn't just hiding a mechanical secret. It was concealing a deeply unsettling dynamic between a woman, a missing man, and a beast that seemed far too wise for its own good. Following the revelations about the hidden escape ramp and the missing performers, Inspector Abernathy brought in an unlikely expert, Dr. Elias Vance, a chemist and amateur naturalist who specialized in forensic decomposition. Vance wasn't interested in fingerprints or lock tumblers. He was focused entirely on the non-human residue left behind in the sun chariot. Vance spent hours analyzing the dust, the sawdust on the cage floor, and the strange metallic smears on the iron bars near the open door. His findings defied conventional understanding of animal escapes. A large mammal leaving a small space should leave behind a potent mix of hair, dander, and strong musky odor. Jupiter had left almost nothing. "The air is clean, Inspector," Vance reported, running a sample of the cage floor dust through his chemical apparatus. "Too clean for a beast that size. It's as if a powerful, rapid current of air swept the cage moments before the discovery." But the most disturbing find was a faint, almost imperceptible residue on the inner bars of the cage, the very bars Jupiter would have brushed against as he exited. Vance identified 2 distinct, bizarre scents mingling with the stale animal musk. The first was a distinct, metallic smell, specifically copper. Not the smell of a coin, but of ionized copper. The scent one associates with blood or freshly struck metal, yet there was no blood anywhere. The second scent was even stranger, ozone. Ozone is a sharp, clean smell often produced by electrical discharge, lightning strikes, or certain chemical reactions. "It's the smell of a machine that has suddenly overheated, Inspector," Vance explained, nervously tapping his notebook. "Or a powerful, momentary surge of energy. A lion, an anarchist, an acrobat, none of them should leave behind the residue of an electrical or chemical reaction." Vance theorized that a powerful, unseen force had been at work inside that gilded prison. Could the hidden mechanism, the pressure plate on the roof, have triggered not just a simple door latch, but some kind of electromagnetic field designed to subdue or manipulate the animal? The evidence pointed away from a conventional escape and toward a strange, disturbing synergy between mechanical design, chemical residue, and a creature that had been subtly altered or perhaps wasn't what it seemed. The metallic scent and the whiff of ozone suggested a transformation, not a simple breakout, and that the beast that walked away was somehow different from the beast that had roared. The inexplicable evidence, the untouched lock, the missing mane 3 blocks away, the vanishing accomplice, and most of all, Dr. Vance's bizarre residue of copper and ozone, forced Inspector Abernathy to confront the dark, unsettling implications of the circus's backlit whispers. The official anarchist theory was now a hollow pretense. The true culprit seemed to defy nature itself. Abernathy pulled the investigation's few remaining threads together. Silas Thorne's dying conviction that Jupiter only leaves when it wants you to know it's gone, Eliza's unsettling stillness while watching the beast, and the architect's panic over the escape ramp. This wasn't a prison break, it was a deliberate, concealed process. The new, terrifying hypothesis developed by Abernathy's small, discrete team became known internally as the transformation theory. It suggested that the sun chariot was not merely a cage, but a mobile containment unit for a creature that was not a pure lion. The rumors of the circus's genetic aberrations were beginning to feel chillingly real. What if Jupiter was the product of some unholy 19th-century scientific experiment, perhaps crossbred to create a beast of impossible size and ferocity, a creature that possessed a biological instability? The ozone and copper could be the chemical byproducts of a rapid, unstable metabolic shift, a spontaneous reorganization of matter triggered by an external, electric source. Eliza, the acrobat, and Maximilian, the ringmaster, were not releasing the lion, they were initiating the change. They had used the pressure plate to trigger a silent, momentary electrical pulse that swept through the bars, explaining the scent of ozone and the ionized copper. This pulse didn't injure the lion, it triggered its metamorphosis. The implication was terrifying. The massive lion did not slip out of the cage. Something human-sized did. This being, shedding a final piece of its lion identity, the mane, 3 blocks away, walked calmly away in a wide-brimmed hat, unnoticed by the frantic crowd who were still staring at the empty cage, searching for a 4-legged king. They were looking for a brute beast, but what they should have been looking for was a man with the eyes of a lion. Inspector Abernathy summoned Mr. Alastair Finch for a final, intense interrogation. Finch, already a nervous wreck, was confronted not with questions about a lock failure, but with the terrifying implications of the transformation theory and the chemical residues. Abernathy showed him Dr. Vance's report. The ionized copper, the ozone, the clean air. The mechanism, Abernathy stated, his voice low and accusatory, was not for the tamer to flee the lion. It was for the lion to flee the cage. Or, rather, for the thing in the cage to escape its form. Cornered, Finch finally revealed the ultimate, catastrophic detail about the sun chariot's design. The emergency egress he described, the concealed ramp and the magnetic catch, was only half the story. It was tied to a secondary, internal system hidden beneath the floorboards, a sophisticated piece of electrical wiring powered by a large Leyden jar concealed in the chariot's undercarriage. This system was the mirror in the menagerie, a term the circus management used, referring to the dark, esoteric concept of perfect duality. Finch had been told it was a heating element, a comfort feature, for the king of the jungle. In truth, the pressure plate on the roof didn't just retract the latch, it initiated a powerful, concentrated electrical pulse through the iron floor of the cage. Finch broke down, confessing that his final design mandate was not to contain, but to facilitate. The inner lock on the small egress door was simple precisely because it was designed to be opened from the inside by a manipulable intelligence. The creature wasn't escaping in a panic, it was performing a final, calculated maneuver. The lion had never been a threat to the performers on the roof, they were its handlers. The double tumbler lock had remained untouched because it was the ultimate distraction, a magnificent facade of security. The creature had used the silent egress, activated by Eliza's deliberate weight shift, to slip out not as a heavy lion, but as a lighter, different entity, before the roar could be missed and the silence noticed. The empty cage was not a sign of failure, it was the perfect completion of the illusion. The truth, when finally pieced together by Inspector Abernathy, was far more disturbing than any sensational headline. The disappearance of Jupiter was not a tragedy, but a meticulously planned exit, the final, perfect act in a monstrous show that spanned generations. The sun chariot wasn't a cage for a lion, it was a mobile chamber designed to facilitate a rapid, controlled transformation, the result of the Barnum organization's dark obsession with genetics and the grotesque. The creature known as Jupiter was not a simple beast, but a biological aberration, a shifting entity. Part animal, part something else, kept stable by Silas Thorne's strange, fierce devotion. The roar, the menacing size, the powerful mane, all were part of the illusion, the form the creature took for the grand spectacle. When Eliza, perched high on the roof, engaged the pressure plate. She didn't open a door to the city, she completed a circuit. The surge of ozone-laced current, the mirror in the menagerie, triggered the creature's unstable nature, forcing a silent, metabolic shift. The great lion contracted, its bones altering, its hide changing, its terrifying weight lessening. It was a brief, painful, yet deliberate metamorphosis. The immense, heavy iron door remained locked because the lion never left through it. The now human-sized entity, utilizing its brief moment of stability and intelligence, simply pushed open the small, low egress door, a latch easily managed from the inside by a being with opposable thumbs. It had been opened with no force, no sound, and no public notice. The creature, now disguised in the clothes of the missing Maximilian, or a costume provided by the two accomplices, slipped out into the thick crowd. The tuft of mane found 3 blocks away was not a casual shedding, but a deliberate taunt, the final, physical proof of the discarded illusion. The city continued to search for a 4-legged king, a dangerous predator. But the king of the jungle was already gone, walking upright, hidden in plain sight, with the eyes of a lion burning beneath a wide-brimmed hat. The police searched the slums for an anarchist, while the true fugitive, the transformed entity and its 2 human handlers, calmly vanished into the labyrinth of New York. The only thing that truly escaped that day was the monstrous secret the circus had guarded for years. The illusion of the caged lion had shattered, revealing the deeper, more chilling horror of the unbound man.